morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here in sunny Halifax. And I'll go straight into my storyline since we are under some serious discipline with regard to time. And if there's one thing I hope to get across, what Liam had to say is a very good introduction that I can segue from, which is to argue that EPAs, as the context of what I have to say in the Caribbean, between the EU and the ACP countries are concrete expressions in the legal and institutional sphere of a broader process of asymmetrical neoliberal economic integration between countries and groups of countries. That they are also elements of specifically of a global strategy of the global north of bilateralization of trade negotiations in response to resistance from the global south for extension, resistance to the extension of the regime of global neoliberalism via the WTO. My case study looks specifically at the EU variant of this global strategy in the context of the EU project of Global Europe, which is a strategy of consolidating intra-EU class power in the interests of capital and neoliberalizing relations with the global south, but also meeting the perceived threat of competition from China, as well as the traditional competition from the US and other competing poles for access to resources and markets. And I also look briefly at the content of the Caribbean EPAs as a specific example of unequal development and projects of autonomous regional integration. Now, I think Liam mentioned the Lomé Convention, and the EPAs, of course, replace the Lomé Convention, which ended in 2000. EU negotiators required ACP negotiators to negotiate on the basis of a template which included the Singapore issues up front. And this became a major bone of contention with a number of the ACP countries, but not, as we shall see, with the Caribbean countries. We know about the asymmetries. We know about the historical background to the contemporary asymmetries in size and levels of development, the colonial, the legacy of the colonial period. But also what's very interesting is that the rhetoric and the jargon of the EPAs conflates or equates development with integration into the world economy via enhanced primarization and incorporation into global commodity chains. So in place of previous, if you like, conceptions of development being very much identified with industrialization and the conquest of greater autonomy on behalf of the developing countries, they equate development with integration into the world economy. The EPAs, therefore, are a specific expression, however, of a global strategy of bilateralization. I think we know about the story of the WTO. We know about the resistance to further liberalization within the WTO, which were dramatized in Seattle in 1999 and in Cancun in 2000, I think in 2003. That is to say, resistance to further liberalization, and especially resistance by the global south to the inclusion of the Singapore issues, having learned, to some degree, learned their lesson from what happened with the Uruguay round negotiations, which produced the WTO. And in response to that, a parallel track strategy, which had in any case always been followed by the global north, now became the center. Bilateral FTAs, misnamed as free trade agreements because they are much more, they are more than simply trade, but also include all these other issues, and being followed by the United States, but the EU being very uniquely positioned with regard to the FTAs. I mentioned 6 or 5 main purposes served by bilateralization. It circumvents opposition from China and India and Brazil and other major powers of the global south by picking off compliant states, states which are either compliant because they are more vulnerable to EU pressures or because their ruling elites are ideologically predisposed in any case to integration into the world economy and so on. So it encircles the major oppositional powers, it divides the global south, weakens the collective bargaining power of the global south, but also the global north is able to use, in many instances, existing one-way preferences as a negotiating weapon in pushing countries to their agenda. And then there's what I call the trade negotiating assets of the global north, which consists of having more than a critical mass of the enormous amount of professional and technical person power which are required in these negotiations. So you have hundreds on the one side in the case of the EU and the United States being able to call on literally hundreds of lawyers, trade negotiators, etc. And in many developing countries have just one or two which have to do everything. Then we have the Global Europe project of the EU, which was finalized in 2006. And Global Europe is properly regarded as a project for the consolidation, if you like, of neoliberal policies within the EU space and externalization in terms of the trade policy of the EU, which I mentioned, that it set out the framework under which bilateral trade agreements would include investments, extended intellectual property rights beyond TRIPS, reduction of everything, in fact, which they had sought to get in the WTO was now included into the EU. My presentation makes the point that the EU, however, was uniquely well positioned for bilateralization of its trade negotiations because of the prior existence of the Lomé Convention with 76 African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, which in turn was a carryover from the colonial preferences granted principally by the United Kingdom and France to their former colonies at the time, which were carried over into independence and then carried over into the European Economic Community and the EU. And that convention, which generated a whole tradition of negotiations between functionaries of the EU and functionaries of the ACP, as well as what I call dependency linkages in terms of trade, reliance on duty-free access, and also dependency linkages in terms of aid, reliance of the ACP elites on EU aid for funding infrastructure, etc., and dependency linkages of you like a cultural and an ideological side. So when the Lomé was ruled incompatible with the WTO in the 1990s, the stage was set now with an existing legal, institutional, economic, and even cultural framework for the EU to bilateralize its really, and incorporate these new principles into a set of bilateral relationships, of bilateral negotiations. Very importantly, in doing so, as I mentioned, the EU set a negotiating template which included the Singapore issues, but also broke up the ACP region into, I think, 5 different configurations: the Caribbean, the Pacific, and 3 in Africa, which right away increased the fragmentation of the ACP and undermined the collective bargaining power. Now, my presentation contrasts the EU Caribbean EPA with a previously existing project of the Caribbean community for the consolidation of a, if you like, a neoliberal open integration project called the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, which was done in response to the challenges of globalization. And it argues, as I'll come to say, that although both the CSME and the Caribbean EPA are neoliberally driven, that there are some interesting and I think significant differences in the way they conceive of the sequencing of integration in response to globalization and the content. The aim of the CSME was to grow regional enterprises, diversify production, and strengthen competitiveness of something which would now be conceived of as a single economic space within the participating countries. Which it was launched in 1989, but it took a considerable amount of time. In fact, it still has not been fully brought into fruition. And at the time the EPA negotiations commenced in 2004, the CSME project was underway. There was a treaty. There were plans to complete the single market and to push on to the single economy, but they were still incomplete, and it was taking a very long time. And now what's interesting here too is that you have different fractions of the regional elites handling the different processes. So you had one fraction handling the CSME project and another fraction handling negotiations with, for the economic partnership agreement with Europe, and doing so in a way which was subsequently, of course, found to be incompatible or to be, in a way, conflictive and contradictory with the CSME project, but which no one cottoned onto at the time. They ought to have, but did not cotton onto at the time. With two separate entities, and you might think it's a small region, and so people would communicate. It doesn't actually work. It doesn't actually work that way. But very importantly, the CARICOM negotiators were drawn into a series of interactions which resulted, whether they started that way or not, certainly at the end, there was a high degree of ideological congruence between the CARICOM negotiators for the EPA and the EU rhetoric about what the EPA should contain and why it should contain it. So you got the integration into the world economy, being incorporated into global commodity chains, liberalizing imports so that competitiveness would be enhanced. How many? 3 minutes. Okay. Being the same rhetoric being echoed by CARICOM negotiators at the end in justifying the agreement that was actually concluded. And my presentation argues that the conclusion of the EPA negotiations, its signing, and it's effectively assuming the status of international treaty law with very detailed provisions for implementation, effectively kills the project for the construction of the CARICOM single market and economy. Now, I argue, therefore, that although both are neoliberal, are driven by, if you like, a neoliberal agenda, there are these differences in terms of scope, in terms of sequencing, and in terms of the embedded policies. But whereas, if you like, very summary form, the CSME development model envisages consolidation of a regional economic space within the Caribbean community prior to engaging with, well, as the basis for engaging with globalization, and implicitly prior to further opening of the economies in a collective sense, including the development of regional enterprises capable of organizing production regionally, owned regionally, and capable of exporting competitively to world markets. Whereas the EPA development model actually pushes that to one side and incorporates the Caribbean community economies with the Dominican Republic, which is about the same size as the CARICOM collectively, and the EU 27 in a seamless economic space where most goods, most capital are freed. Technical personnel movement is also freed. And importantly, there are common policies across that entire space which make no distinction between local enterprises and EU enterprises, which is national treatment, so-called level playing field, and you know, of course, what will happen in that context. So, and this is speculation here, the most likely result of that framework would be a new round of primarization, and Caribbean economies, insofar as development or insofar as investment is stimulating, it would be via global sourcing by the EU firms of raw materials, food, and low-cost labor, and a possible trend for borrowing from Raul Delgado Rice, maquiladorization of these economies. I have in I think I'm just about up, I have in my presentation answering the question, why did Caribbean elites do that, and can it be salvaged? But that will be for the presentation.